Well, good evening again, and welcome to the presentation of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. Tonight's presentation is Vermont Fall Shorebird Migration, a photographic essay with Matthew Bode, and we're all excited to see his gorgeous photos and hear all about it. First, we're going to have an introduction by Pat Phillips, who is sitting in for our president, Jeff Hellstrong of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. Pat?
Great, thanks, Tom. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Pat Phillips, and I'm a member of the board of directors of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, which is a chapter of Audubon Vermont covering Franklin, Grand Isle, and Chittenden counties. If you receive the Audubon magazine and live in one of those counties, you're most likely a member of Green Mountain Audubon, and we're grateful for your membership. If you're not and you're interested in joining, I pasted in the chat section of this, and you can scroll down below and hit chat. And there's a link right there which will enable you to gain more information and to join the chapter if you're not a member. This evening, as Tom mentioned, the Green Mountain Audubon Society, in association with Friends of Missisquoi, is pleased to host Matthew Bode, who will share some of his extraordinary photos and expertise regarding shorebird migration in the Champlain Valley. We offer this program freely to our members and the general public in the spirit of generosity. If you'd like to support our programs such as this and others, and our mission to protect birds through community involvement, education, and conservation efforts, you can make a donation at the page linked in the chat. And for many of you who've made those donations, we're most grateful for that. Finally, we always try to be mindful that the region in which our chapter of Audubon Vermont is based has been sacred to Indigenous people for thousands of years. We respect that the Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of the lands and waters of this area and recognize the hardships they continue to endure. We're grateful for the opportunity to share this place and to work to help to protect it. And now it's my pleasure to turn this back to Tom Giamocello, who will serve as our master of ceremonies for this evening. Tom.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'm going to read the introduction that Jacob Crawford wrote of Matthew right from the events page of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. Matthew has been a lifelong lover of wildlife. Since watching National Geographic and searching for lions, tigers, and bears in his backyard as a youngster, he's never really grown out of being that boy. Matt discovered birdwatching with his grandpa as a kid and picked it up again as an adult. After his wife bought him his first camera, Matthew started using photography to identify birds and to document the experience. More recently, photography has, for Matt, become the focus, while still enjoying the experience of spending time with wildlife. We will be enjoying spending time with Matt and spending time with wildlife. So with no further ado, I turn it over to Matthew Bode. Matthew, take it away. Oh, excuse me, folks. Let's talk about the question. Sorry, Matthew. If you have a question during the presentation, please, using the chat feature, type it right into the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat as we progress. And Matthew has told me that he has about 5 sections to his presentation tonight. At the end of each section, he will wait and take questions. If there's a question that's germane, I'll try to sneak it in as he is doing a photo. With no further ado, Matthew, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you to Clem, to Pat, and Tom for the opportunity to share some time with you guys this evening and go through some photos and talk a little bit about just the experience of going through a shorebird migration and doing photography to capture a lot of that experience. Just quick kind of introduction. My name is Matthew Bode. I live up in St. Albans. So I've primarily birded in the Franklin area. Franklin County area. I do get down to Chittenden quite a bit, sometimes Addison around there. But the longer I've been doing this, the more I try to stay closer to home. It enables me to get more time actually out in the field and less time traveling to different sites. I want to go through a few things for this evening. Kind of have it broken down here, a little bit on the background, how I got into and kind of progressed, because it's been an evolution going through the photography experience, part of birding. Talk some about the field craft, about actually getting into the field and being able to progress in photography, especially with shorebirds. Spend a little time on the things that you can, I think, experience more uniquely through photography, as far as bird behavior is concerned. Some of the environments kind of associated with that as well. And then a few minutes at the end to just talk about some of the goals that I've set as using birding as a subject and something that's a little bit more of a fine art than it is just documentation. So quick background, mentioned already, but Grandpa got me into birding as a kid. Went out in East Texas and saw a pileated woodpecker as my strike bird, as you were. And from there, he got me a book from Audubon, got me a pair of binoculars from my mom, and I was off and running. Birded kind of on and off from there up until a point when I was had some downtime at work in 2016. Found myself with just some time to start to get back into it again, and started birding pretty heavily. I was in North Carolina at the time. I was still traveling for work all the time. So my birding at that point in time was a lot different than what it is today. I spent a lot of time going to different locations and trying to see as many different species as quickly as I could, but not spending a lot of time really learning about any one species or spending a lot of time with them. It was really interesting. I got to see a lot of different things. It was a huge learning experience because I didn't know what most of them were. And I used binoculars for a little while. As mentioned, my wife ended up buying me a camera for Christmas, and I looked at her and told her, you know what you just did, right? This is going to get used. And sure enough, I took it out in the field and, started using it when I was on the road. I was using the camera at the time to do a whole lot of documentation. So taking pictures, I had like a 300 zoom at a pretty good distance, and then taking them back home, trying to blow them up, crop them, and try to get an ID on them. And I learned a lot of birding just that way. COVID happened. Had some life changes that happened around the same time for myself. And in 2020, started getting into photography more as a primary goal than birding and using the camera as just a way to kind of complement it at that point in time. Here's my strike bird, just a picture of a pileated. This is more recent. I didn't take this when I found the pileated at 8 years old or whatever it was. But for me, it's still, it's a magnificent bird. And I think it was something just catching about realizing this is, potentially in your backyard. It's not just something that's exotic or something that, you see on National Geographic, some faraway place. These are things that actually you can find if you want to spend some time and go out and look at them. There's another strike bird if I have. I'm using strike bird as a term just to say that's what got me going. That struck the interest for me. And I'm showing this photo, which is not the first, but it's one of the first photos I ever posted to social media of a bird. And I don't know what it was, but something about this bird on this day, it was out at Delta Park. Even though I knew what it was and it kind of gotten used to seeing it, something made me want to photograph it differently. And I laid down on the ground and tried to take a shot from the distance as you see it here. This is not cropped. And not a great photo, but it did kind of get me interested in how to do photography better than just how to bird better. I posted this online, asked for some help, and got a handful of people that reached out to me and were very, very helpful. One of which is Kyle Tansley, who I've remained in contact and really good friends with to this day. We spent a lot of time, and I learned a lot from him. And I'll actually bring him up again here later on in the presentation. But from there, this is all I want to do is to go actually spend time getting closer and closer to birds, to watch them more than just to be seen at a quarter-mile distance and trying to get a photograph to ID. Now it's more about how do I get detail. So here, started pressing in, getting a little bit closer, to be able to watch, a lot more patience. Now I'm not trying to go an inch deep and a mile wide like I had gotten used to when I was traveling and looking at a lot of different birds, a lot of species I didn't know. Now it's trying to slow down and actually take some time and watch things. Watch how they behave, watch how each species behaves, watch how each bird individually behaves, and you start to learn from there. And I think the reason I mention all this, especially in light of photography, is there are people that get into bird photography usually one of two ways, either from the birding side or from the photography side. And each has its challenges, but I think each has its benefits to bring into the picture. I came at this from birding, so I had a pretty good background in understanding at least how to identify birds and how a lot of them behave. Being able to use that and leverage that into better photographs really helped. But I had to learn a whole lot on the photography side. And that's really what I've spent more time doing the last couple of years. Image like this was at the time really cool for me. It was probably a really good photo to me, even though I look back at it today and think that maybe it's not the best. But it certainly got my interest in getting closer to birds, and probably took that pretty seriously for a little bit, and pressing in and trying to get some detail. You can see in this image, the eyes in focus, and even the tip of the bill and the back of the bird is not. Super narrow depth of field, especially considering how close I was. Watched this bird for maybe like an hour, super comfortable walking inside of my focal range. I got a focal range on my lens of somewhere around 7 feet. Inside of 7 feet, I can't take a picture. And I've definitely had shorebirds just walk through it. Learned how to be patient with them, and how to approach and kind of lay down and stay low. Shorebirds are probably the easiest ones to get close to. They're the most tolerant of people. If you sit tight, a lot of times they'll come up to you, and that's actually the best way to photograph them, is just to be patient, wait for them to come to you. So really tight shots, kind of got used to that, and just loving the detail. Just wanted to be as get as close. I had a longer lens at this point in time, as close as I could get, and the more detail that I could get, I was just loving it. And it was just something really exciting about being able to see that. Last couple images here are semi-palmated plovers. Here's a tidbit for you, something that I would never have seen before the last couple of years, where I kind of learned how to photograph shorebirds better. But you can see the webbing in the feet. They're called semi-palmated, which actually means they have partial webbing in their feet. And the webbing extends between all 3 toes, as opposed to a common plover, which we have once in a blue moon, is probably putting it generously. It only has webbing between 2 of the toes, and the other one it just goes all the way up. It's just like one of these like super cool things that I think most people aren't able to see, and it's kind of hard to see through binoculars, maybe through a scope. But when you're sitting there just watching a bird, 10 feet away from you for an extended period of time, you're able to start picking some things up that you weren't able to see. And that was just fascinating to me. Kind of from there, really got into probably what are more classic profile shots. Here's a white rump sandpiper. Pretty typical shot. You can kind of see the details. You can make out a lot of field marks. You see the bicolored bill. You see the eye line. You can see a little bit of the coloring on the back. You see the wings extending beyond the tail. Really easy to see. Makes it a lot easier to identify birds when you're able to take really clear pictures like this. But even this image, I look back at it now and I think there's not a whole lot of color here. It is just on mud. It's really easy to see birds when they're out there in the mud, a lot easier to photograph them. You don't have a lot of obstructions like grass or trees or anything like that, but not necessarily as pretty an image. And so I started putting some focus into getting color into them. This is a harder image to take. A lot of these birds, not all of them, but a lot of them will forage through grass, and white rump sandpiper is one of them, along with some of the little ones like the leaf sandpipers do that a lot too. And this one was hanging out with a few leaf sandpipers. This is up at Campbell Bay at the north end of the lake. So shooting through a window of grass makes it a lot tougher. You have to have a whole lot more patience to be able to capture something like that and to kind of stick with it to make it work. But not stopping short with just greens, try to inject other colors, start looking at sunsets, trying to look at oranges and pinks and other things in the sky, and started bringing those things in as well. The other thing I try to work on is getting unobstructed shots and getting really clean images. I don't use Photoshop. I don't remove things from objects except in rare cases. I've got a few times I've gotten water inside the lens and had some things on the sensor that I had to clean up. Other than that, the images you see are what I saw in the field. If there's trees there, if a branch is there, if a clump of mud is there, either I leave it in there or I select a different photo and move on. And getting those clean images is hard. It takes a whole lot of awareness in the field of what's going on. It takes a lot of predictability about how birds are moving. Whenever I approach and I get into the field to start photographing, the first thing I'll do is actually pull out the binoculars or my camera and just watch them for a while. I'll stand at a great distance and just kind of see what's going on. How are the birds acting today? every day is a little different, and being able to understand it before I ever step foot in the water or get close to them is really helpful. From there, started working on actually backing up after getting really tight and close. Started thinking, how do I actually start injecting parts of the environment, parts of other things that are going around the scene, other than just getting really tight cropped images. And here's some mountains in the background. This is across the lake. I'm laying on one side at Delta Park and shooting across. That's the New York side. It's such a super calm day. You could see reflections. You know, this is probably a quarter of the way out to where this egret is. And I don't know what you define as a shorebird, whether or not you can see it from a shore, it counts or not, but this is a harrier. I have seen them come up to the shore and land on the shore a few times, and I was actually out at north end of the lake as well when I was able to see one kind of cruising over and ended up perching out on some limbs out there. And I think being able to kind of step back and capture the scene starts to speak to me more now than it did at the time when I was really most interested in getting that close detail. Then kind of the one of the harder things to do is then to go back into getting closer and tighter shots and still maintain some sense of depth and trying to capture some piece of environment so you can feel how this day was. I mean, this is a super overcast day. This is one of the sandbars out at Delta Park where some sanderlings were scooting around. There's two of them, and one would start eating, the other one would come and chase him off and trying to eat what he had and keep going down the sandbar. And I just sat there and would wait for a while watching. Here's a Lee sandpiper. Same kind of thing, is trying to put some depth and the color, still maintain the detail and create an image that I think looks pretty good, as much as it is informative from a scientific standpoint, looking at field marks and just the overall detail in the image. Last image here I'll show you is one that I was really proud of at the time. It's a couple years old at this point. Went out to Delta Park, intended to be out there for sunset, and went out there. Gosh, it's probably about 90 minutes before sunset went down, and went out there just to see what I could see. I was really intent on just playing around with the camera and trying to figure out how to shoot sunsets with birds, not knowing there's a ruddy turnstone out there. This is an early migrate. I think this is in July, so certainly not what I expected to see when I got out there. But I ended up spending the whole time with this bird and just watch him. You know, he'd sit there for a while, he'd feed, he'd stop and he'd preen, take a little bit of a nap. And those are pretty common behaviors. And was able to kind of combine what I knew about, you know, wanting to line up with the ruddy turnstone, which is kind of a cool bird for July around here. But then also to kind of work on some of the technical aspects of photography to make it work and make this image work. So I was really, really pleased with some of the time I was able to spend with this one. Stop there for just a minute. Tom, how are we doing on questions?
Well, I think you're just mesmerizing everybody, Matthew, because there are no questions right now. So
keep plugging away.
Keep plugging along, and I'll let you know the next break.
Sure. So talk for a little bit about fieldcraft. What I mean by that is shooting out in the field. So when I first started looking at photographs of birds, probably started too hard into trying to edit my way to a better image rather than knowing how to go out and shoot differently, how to spend time with them, how to understand, predict behaviors, trying to many times getting closer to them in ways that are still not disturbing them. And then, you know, pulling out a better image that then when you go back to edit or you look at it later, you're not trying to overwork an image. A couple things that I'll throw in here. I got a couple slides, probably common knowledge for folks that follow shorebirds migration pretty routinely through Vermont. But these are the ones that, and I'm kind of arbitrarily saying these are the more common ones. These are the ones probably a little bit easier to find, a little bit easier to reliably go photograph at some point during shorebird migration in the fall. These come and go at different times. We'll see different species in July, which is pretty early. August will start to pick up. September is probably peak. And then you get different species that come in, you know, through October into November and kind of fades out from there. These are the ones I would consider less common. They certainly come through. I think we have them come through. All these species come through every year, but just typically not in as great numbers, can be harder to find and maybe not staying for as long. So when I see some of these species show up, I'm a little bit more intentional about trying to spend time with them if at all possible. And as I get into field craft, there's one other thing I got to mention about disturbing birds, and this is kind of arch nemesis here. Love peregrine falcons, love merlins, but they're terrible on an outing for shorebird photography. Number of times I've gotten in a kayak, I've paddled out, get out on the sandbar, get set up, lay down, start to take a photograph, and then a peregrine buzzes the beach, and they're gone for the rest of the evening. And you're nothing in hand. That's part of it. I mean, that's part of shorebird migration. These birds of prey come to find them. Here's an image. This is actually my buddy Kyle in the background. But just want to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like to actually be on the field. I'm laying, I don't know how far I am, probably from 20 feet maybe. And there's just shorebirds kind of cruising around us, walking through the water. We'll lay out in the water, few inches of water in this case. I've been a little bit deeper. There's other cases where I've been in inches of mud, just absolutely terrible mud. I, here in the last year, actually ended up getting a dry suit to help keep me warm. Been getting in the water even when it's down to 30 something degrees, just to keep it safe. And one of the things that can be challenging, specifically the dry suit, does kind of get some air in it. So this is in breeding plumage dunlin, and you can kind of tell from the water here that it's moving, it's lapping up onto the shore. One of the challenges in the dry suit is if I'm laying down with the air in it, sometimes my legs will float, and trying to hold still well enough to take an image without getting a camera blur in there is kind of a challenge, a unique challenge. Another thing that I don't think most people realize is, especially with sunrises and sunsets, shooting into that can be really bright. It's really easy to blow out the image. So another thing just kind of have to be aware of, and is a challenge with a bird moving around at the same time, is trying to lock focus and pay attention to what the bird is doing. Here you got a semi-palmated plover, and they're a little bit easier because if you're not familiar with their feeding habits, they'll run and stop, and when they stop, you got to kind of be ready to take the shot. Because when they're off running again, they're off running. You don't know which way they're going to go. Trying to do that across a really bright sun can be a challenge, and trying to keep the focus. Sometimes your camera doesn't know what to do with the light, and certainly not blind yourself. Other thing that I've taken advantage of more here in the past year is blue hour. What I mean by that, golden hour is typically defined as like an hour from the time the sun comes up to an hour later. And the evening, the last hour of daylight. Blue hour is the time before sunrise and the time after sunset. This is an image from first thing in the morning. I don't know what time this was, but it was probably 20 minutes or so before the sun came up, and the colors are super soft. There's no direct sunlight yet, and you can get some nice pinks and blues. It's also a wonderful time to smell birds. I think sunrises are harder with shorebirds. They seem to be a little bit more skittish in the morning. They can't see as well until the sun comes up and they start to get daylight. The evenings tend to work out a little bit better. If you get out there in time, you can kind of be accustomed to them. They're used to you. There's no surprises. And then once the sun goes down, they're still oftentimes feeding, sometimes springing, sometimes they're going to sleep. Just to kind of give another example of kind of sticking it through, this image is probably a few minutes after sunset. You can still see some pretty heavy oranges in the background. This is at Colchester Causeway, out there on the flats out by Law Island. This marbled, I'm sorry, not marbled, that's Hudsonian Godwit. Marbled would be great. Hudsonian Godwit was not giving me the time of day. It's a bird that when I showed up, probably an hour and a half before sunset, just wasn't wanting to come to me, wasn't wanting to spend time. I didn't push it. I went and found some other things. I was actually laying down photographing some smaller, one of the peeps. I don't know what it was, but this guy would just walk across the path and just hung out for a while. And I stuck with it and got into even some blue hour images. So this is, I mean, you can tell that the daylight's really going at this point in time. Really having to work some of the settings to make it work. But it's just kind of a really cool thing to be out there just watching these guys still feeding half an hour, 45 minutes after dark sometimes. Anyhow, just a few things that kind of have to go through. have to be willing to get muddy, get wet, be very cold. But it's been a really enriching experience. Stop there, Tom. We got any questions?
Well, we do have a question, and it is from somebody who said he may be planning on this already, but I would like to know what he uses for equipment.
Sure. So I have used 2 different cameras, and I am not a good person to talk about gear. I'll tell you what I have, but I've spent way more time in things like fieldcraft and trying to take better images than I have trying to get different equipment. I was using a Nikon D5500 initially with a 55 to 300 zoom. And when I say 55 to 300 zoom, that means I was maxed out at 300 all the time. That's still kind of challenging at times. I've switched over 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago. I got the Nikon 200 to 500 zoom lens, and I'm now shooting on a D500, Nikon D500 body. The D500 is an excellent, and by the way, that D500 and the 2 to 500 zoom lens is an excellent setup for bird photography. It's very fast. The D500, if you put an XQD card along with an SD card in there, it can shoot, I think, up to 11 frames per second if you really have to have it. It's overkill in almost every case, but that can be really good. Got a couple of images coming where it shows like worm pools. I could not have done that on my old gear. Being able to shoot quickly when there's action in the frame is really helpful with that setup. Tom, if you don't have any others, I can keep going.
You are going to be keeping going. Thank you for all of that. It sounded like another foreign language that I don't speak, but I'm sure the poster is very happy to get the information. Yes, take it away.
Sure, and I'm gonna steer clear of most technical conversation and gear related content for here, but I'm more than happy to answer questions as they come. Bird behavior. So there's a few things that I think are important. One, photography, especially if you want to go see something in particular, capture something specific, it takes both patience and persistence. So patience is taking a time on an outing. Persistence is taking multiple outings. It's one thing to sit there for 2 hours and try to watch the same birds and try to capture something. It's another thing to go out there for 2 hours and not get the image and then want to be crazy enough to say, you know what, I'm gonna try that again tomorrow and try to make it work. And I think it takes both, especially if you're trying to do something really specific. Other couple notes I put on here, it does encourage slower birding, which I didn't appreciate initially, but I've really come to appreciate. There's something so different to me from the way I used to bird, kind of blowing through areas with binoculars and trying to get IDs and counts and lists, and I still do some of that. But there's such a different enriching experience about, laying next to birds for a couple hours and just being with them. It's a lot slower way to approach it, but I think it's brought some really cool experiences with it. And then the last note I have on here is that typically when you get out in the field, it starts with profiles, meaning you're just taking shots of the bird, kind of iconic, images where you get some pretty good detail, pretty good, show what the bird looks like, but not necessarily do anything in particular. And as you sit there and watch them, you start to see what they're doing, and you can follow it around. You start to get some better action shots. Action shots. So one thing we're not going to talk about here, and you're not going to see just because we're talking about fall migration for shorebirds, is all the behavior that happens in springtime around raising young. Everything from courting behaviors to actually having chicks and raising them. We don't have very many. We have very few species in shorebirds that actually breed in Vermont. So most of the kind of action you're going to see, especially in the fall, is not related to all that. You're going to see other things like feeding is probably the number one thing that you're going to notice. Here's a leaf sandpiper picking something out of the mud there. This is a little bit older image. It's black-bellied plover. This is one of the earlier images I took when I got into a little bit more serious about photography. I think it was a little bit of luck. I didn't know what I was doing at the time and managed to pull this one out. But since then, I'm a little bit more intentional and a little bit better about predicting how birds are how they're going to be feeding, kind of where they're headed. even semi-palmated plovers, and they can seem erratic in the way they run. They run and stop, and then they run and stop. And they're trying to guess almost where that next wormhole is going to be, and to be able to get that image while it's happening. I've gotten definitely better at that. And I think there's nothing short of trial and error and just being able to try some different things and get some things wrong before you get to a point where you got a little bit firmer lock on. I'll also mention, just for context, and I do post on social media. I know there's folks probably on here that have seen a photo or two over time. I've took probably north of 40,000 images last year, and somewhere 70, 75,000 the previous year. And the number of images I've posted ever is probably under 1,000. So at best, someone has seen less than 1% of all that I've shot. So what we're looking at today are things that, I'm pretty proud to show, but there's so many garbage photos and a lot of learning that's gone into it. Other behavior, still feeding, but depending on species, instead of pulling worms, this Hudsonian godwit's got its head under the water, and there's a few other species that'll do that as well. I've seen like stilt sandpipers do the same thing, to where they're going all the way down. What's really impressive about this guy's probably standing in 1.5 inches, 2 inches of water or so. And if you've ever seen their bill, it's really long. And so you see how far his head is into the water, and that bill's all the way into the ground from there. Other things, kind of weird things you'll see sometimes. This guy, I sat there and watched him, I don't know, it was 15, 20 minutes, sleeping, just sleeping on one leg. A lot of birds sleep on one leg. And then just out of nowhere, he just started screaming, probably screamed for about 5 minutes, just intermittently letting out this really loud peep. Never figured out what it was at or what made him start and stop, but went back to sleep. Just kind of weird thing that happens. You see a lot of running around. See birds kind of chasing each other around, depending on what's going on. It's not uncommon to see some of these shorebirds that kind of find some food worth having, and somebody else will come over and either eat it with them or try and push them off of it. And this might not be everybody's taste, but I thought it was kind of funny. It's actually some things left behind by a Canada goose that a semi-palmator has come over and stood next to, almost as if he wants to say it's his, which I think is, at the time, I thought was pretty interesting to look at. I mentioned sleeping earlier. I have watched birds just sleep for a long time. They sleep in different ways, a lot on one leg. Many of them will also tuck under. They'll take the bill and they'll put it underneath the wing, and they'll either sometimes close their eyes entirely or pop them over intermittently. Somebody like what I'm showing here, lesser yellow legs, will, as they're sleeping, a lot of times rotate around, and so that way they can get a better field of vision. So even on one leg, they just kind of rotate back and forth so that they can open their eyes and see. Other thing that can happen as you're watching, if you're locked on and you're in pretty good shape and they're used to you, is you get a little lucky and you get to like a takeoff shot. So here's a couple lesser yellow legs. I kind of had set up, I was anticipating sunset later on. They ended up taking off before that, but managed to get a launch shot just because I was there. Next image is kind of an interesting one. This is taken probably a couple years ago. It's another godwit. This is out at the Causeway as well. There's a single, I think it's a juvenile Hudsonian godwit, and we do get probably a little bit more on the juvenile side for many species, especially late in the year. And this was in sometime in November. I don't know how late, but it was definitely late in the migration season. And it was a single bird that was standing out in the water. Went out there and watched it for a while. I was actually photographing this one with Kyle, and while we were watching it, it threw up. Didn't see necessarily anything that was in it that was like pellet necessarily, but I think that's what it was. And just we had probably been sitting there for 45 minutes watching the bird sleep, and it wasn't doing anything. It woke up, it threw up, and then it went back to sleep. Just trying to rest up for the journey. They got a long ways to go. But knowing that it did that and watching it do that, and then watching the behaviors, and it's kind of a weird thing. They'll actually, you can see him start to, it's almost like a cat trying to get a fur ball up. And you can see that neck start to go. And that was the first time that I'd ever seen that actually happen. So fast forward, I was watching some lesser yellowlegs, and I saw one of them start to do the same thing. And I was already set up, kind of watching these pinks and blues that were happening over the mountains in the background. And when I saw this one start to do that, I turned and got an image of it. It's not super sharp focus, but it was really cool. It's a little bit after dark, and watching this thing, throw up a pellet out there on the boat ramp was kind of a cool thing to see. I don't think I would have known to look for that and try to be able to capture that if I hadn't seen the guidebook do it already. Since then, I've seen a few others do it. I've seen yellowlegs especially do it, but it's a really hard thing to predict and try to capture on film. Tom, stopping point there if you've got any.
Full speed ahead.
All right. Next section, I want to talk through environment. So I wanted to talk a lot about trying to get tight and detailed and some of the just iconic images about some of these shorebirds. One of the things that I really tried to interject here in the past year or so is trying to back out and get some environmental shots with it to kind of give a little bit better sense of where these birds live and how they live. I think that can be really, in some cases, classic in the sense you see something, you're like, oh yeah, that matches that bird. But then there's also times when you see a bird kind of out of its normal environment, and that's kind of striking and kind of cool in itself too. So trying to be able to identify that and capture that in a meaningful way is kind of its own challenge as well. So first one I'm going to show you is killdeer. This is actually one that does breed in Vermont, so it's here a little bit longer. They do start to leave later in the fall, and their young will be with them once they're ready to get up and go. But here I'm trying to show some of the rocky habitats that killdeer tend to be in, as opposed to some of the other ones we've looked at that don't. Tend to prefer habitats like this, or you don't see them too often in the rockier banks, and this can be anything from could be the actual lake and on Lake Champlain. It can be just rocks around cow pastures. I mean, they're pretty flexible and adaptable to different environments. But that, and then just the calm waters that are around it, give a little bit of a nice reflection for this killdeer. Other cool thing that I was able to see this year that I don't know that I've seen until this past year, this past season, were dunlin and breeding plumage. Magnificent birds. I mean, they turn really gray, and that's what I was used to. When they come through October, they're one of the later species through here. October is probably the heavier month for the dunlin. But really cool looking bird, and he's got that really nice drooping bill. I think it makes really good photographs just because of the shape of the bird, and you're able to tell and identify this bird just based on shape, and so you can do some kind of cool things with them. This was probably taken a couple of years ago, but it's still my favorite image that I've taken of a snipe. I don't even remember what I was looking for, but it was not a snipe, and I was kind of down in the grass looking for whatever it was along the shore. I think it was probably a spotted sandpiper or something like that, and this snipe just kind of came up and peered at me for a while and then started feeding. And it's the closest I've been and the longest period of time I've ever had with a snipe, but that was pretty cool. And I think, showing this mixed up with some of the grass and all is really appropriate for snipe. I think they're, my experience at least, has been hard to get clean images of them and see them very clearly, with the exception of telephone wires, which is not the fine art image I'm usually aiming for, even though they're really in plain view at that point. Once in a while I'll get one on a fence post, but not that time. Other thing I try to show is the light that comes through at the beginning of the day. I do tend to shoot. I'm more of a morning person, love to be out with birds more in the morning, and didn't actually ever spend time in the evening with birds until I got into shorebird photography, because shorebirds do, to me, seem to be more tolerant, more cooperative, a little bit more comfortable shooting in the evening. So trying to go out there and capture a little bit of the scene as much as I am with the birds. And here's a couple of those Dunlin that are just kind of hunkering down for the night. This is actually taken around the same place. It's a semi-palmated plover, but just another look at the sunset going down. There's a bunch of grasses behind them that are kind of getting blurred out there as it's hunkering down for the night as well. This is out at Delta Park. It almost looks to me, and one of the reasons I like this image is it looked like it was at a beach. It doesn't look necessarily like it belongs in Vermont too much. This is a sandbar. I shot this at a slower speed. I think it was either at sunset or after. There's no direct sunlight. It enabled me to slow the shutter speed down a bit, and it gives a little bit more of a blurred effect. So almost like a beachy feeling, like the waves have crashed over. It's kind of what they were doing is they're lapping up on the sandbar. And in this sanderling, this is probably July, early migrant. Still has a lot of color in the plumage. Just kind of cruising through there on its own, and was able to get a pretty interesting image. Other thing that I absolutely love are calm waters, where you can get some pretty good reflections. But if there's no direct sunlight, if there's pretty cloudy day, what tends to happen, especially when you're shooting a bird at closer range, is the horizon starts to kind of melt away. You can see just a little bit of a almost blue band just above the bird's head in this image. But for the most part, that horizon has disappeared as it's kind of blurred out, and is such a almost an indescribable feeling to be out there where it's so calm. It's so serene and sometimes really quiet, except for the noises that some of these birds are making. And to be able to kind of capture that image in a really clean way is really so. Tom, any more come through?
Again, I tell you, young man, you're just kind of mesmerizing everybody. I encourage people to use the chat feature and to post a question that I will relay to Matt, but no questions yet. Let's see more.
Sure. So last section here is we're going to just talk about my personal journey. As much as it's been about birding, has also kind of transformed and evolved over time to kind of target this more as wildlife art. And doing that is its own challenge. It's different than birding. One of the challenges I've had while being out there photographing is doing what I call legitimate birding at the same time. It's extremely difficult when you're really locked in and trying to pay attention to a bird, watch what they're doing, watch what direction they're headed. You're looking at the scene, you're looking at the light and all those things. Is to also be listening at the same time and trying to create lists of what birds, what species. It's really hard to do both at the same time. Oftentimes I'll dedicate my time to one or the other. It's become increasingly more on the photography side. But there's definitely times I get out, especially when the light's not good during the day, and do a little bit more either scouting for areas and species, or trying to get locations, trying to find new places, new things to shoot. And I do listing a lot more during those kinds of times. So with all that, I've definitely moved more into trying to target better and better images as just kind of a personal goal. And that kind of changes the way you approach it as well. So as I mentioned, times to photograph, cloudy days can be really good because you can get decent light most of the time. But when you get direct sunlight, those shooting windows can be really brief. First thing in the morning, last thing before sunset, and sometimes a little bit of blue hour depending on how things are going. Something else is really, I think, unique to wildlife photography is there's a wide range of how much you edit, and I won't go into the spectrum here, but my personal goal is to try to represent in an image what I saw through the viewfinder, what I saw when I looked through the lens, and trying to make things look that way. And sometimes that means editing less and trying to let the image speak for itself and what I captured. Having said that, I also know how to kind of push some of the technical elements of the camera to pull things out that are harder to do, at least that I didn't know how to do in years past. And then the last piece, which I'll show just a little bit, is trying to push the limits and experiment a little bit. So just to give a little bit of flavor, I got a couple images here that are very similar. I think they were taken probably minutes apart, but just trying to take different types of images or different looks to an image in the same scene. I'll also tell you with some of these birds, when I'm shooting backlit into the sun, I have an extremely hard identifying the species, especially in the field. Sometimes I have to come back and pull the light up to be able to see what they are. So this is a sandpiper. I'm guessing this is a semi-palmated sandpiper, kind of cruising across. It's a little bit darker image, kept the whites down, shot this a little bit more underexposed. And here's one where it's a little bit brighter. Just kind of gives a little bit different feel to the image, but just kind of trying to play around with that and find images that look aesthetically pleasing, things that I think are beautiful, but also represent the bird at hand, and is representative of how this bird behaves and what they look like. Shooting into, I've done a lot of silhouettes. I've done a ton of silhouettes, but trying to capture detail in the silhouettes as well. I also think this is a semi-palmated sandpiper. Just dipped its head in the water and just watched it doing a little bit of bathing, and captured this image where you can see some of the water drops suspended in the air, which is kind of a cool looking thing. Kind of another thing, this is called low key, where it's predominantly a black scene, and the bird, it really stands out. I took this image in broad daylight. This is probably 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock on a bright sunny day out at Delta Park. I usually don't pull the camera out at that time of day, but with a white bird, I was able to really underexpose the image and just let the whites kind of poke through. There's trees and stuff around here, but I kept it so dark that you can't see them. It's actually standing on a branch out in the water. Kind of another example of silhouettes. This is right as sun is going down. It's really hard to get birds to silhouette against the sun, just because we don't have the sun never hits the water like it does on a coast. We have the mountains and trees and everything else in the way. So one way I kind of get around that for, in Vermont for shooting is to shoot birds into the reflection of the sun on the water or on the sand. And that's what this is. It's actually a goal, but I was out there shooting shorebirds, and this guy was cooperative enough to do that. Played around with black and white, still kind of playing around with that to kind of get different contrasts. I think it works well with birds that have shape and contrast to them. The egrets, that have they're just brilliant whites, and it can be really good to kind of show that as well. Other thing that I've kind of shot to achieve is capturing how it felt to be in the environment, in the atmosphere. It's almost a mood. He's trying to capture a mood, and I think this image is maybe a good example of what a day felt like going out there. This is a pretty gloomy morning. This is after sunrise, but no sun that day. Really dark, really kind of hard to shoot, and not much going on out at the water. But there were a handful of egrets that were across, basically hanging out, not even feeding, just kind of hanging out across the water. Another example of the silhouettes and really trying to capture some of the oranges, really intense light on this day. One of the things I think is challenging and really keeps me interested is that there's no 2 days alike. The light's never exactly the same. The clouds aren't in the same place. The humidity is different. All the things that can affect how you take an image, just all those variables. Every day is different. It's its own challenge. It can be highly frustrating, but when you pull away an image that you are proud of, it's really rewarding as well. I've shot a lot more here in the last year, as I mentioned, before and after dark, or before sunrise and after dark. Here's one that's after dark and trying to capture some of the softer colors. One that I showed a second ago, really bright oranges and blacks. and kind of broken away from doing that all the time and trying to lean a little bit more into the shot that I can get. That's maybe a better image. And here's an example of not trying to overwork an image and just say, this is a pretty soft evening, and just shoot a soft image. Here's a sanderling running in the water. Same kind of thing, pretty soft image. I've really come around to appreciating images like this. I think it's kind of serene and really peaceful to see as they're ducking about. And here's a lesser yellowlegs. This was actually taken around some boat docks, and I was really working to shoot around and not include one in there. You can probably see a dark spot on the left-hand side that I think is remnant of one of them in the distance, but really trying to capture the birds, in and out of the obstructions that are around there can be certainly a challenge. The location that I shot this at, I've shot many times. This is extremely nasty mud. That kind of mud where, for every 5 minutes you're there, you're another 1.5 inches sinking into it. I mean, elbows down, knees down, coming out smelling beautiful. Wife loads the laundry that night. A couple other things I've kind of experimented with. This is not going to come across in this image exactly. It's kind of the last endeavor from this last fall season that I'm going to pick up again, is doing a little bit of underwater work. So part of the frame is actually under the water, and just try and show the expanse and just kind of the calmness that exists on an evening like this. Really nice pinks in the air. The water was super calm, and these birds were just hanging out on this log. There's driftwood on the left-hand side. And I was shooting them for a little while, and then one of them decided it wanted to go feed, and you see that one kind of walking up to the right-hand side. They go off, and eventually 2 of them went off, and the other one sat there for a while and was able to capture it. Another thing that I am going to try and capture, this is a really weird image, and it's probably not everybody's cup of tea. This is a semi-palmated plover, and I did an extended capture on this. What I'm kind of thinking to do is think about what's iconic to a species and what makes a species different from something else. And to me, one of the coolest things about semi-palmated plovers is the feeding behavior. It's that action that kind of you stand and you move and you stand again, and trying to capture how it's there one moment and then it's gone. And an image like this is kind of a creative idea that I've started a little bit and want to continue. So I'm going to continue to experiment on that next shorebird migration season. Last one I'm going to show you, it was an experiment that I was pretty pleased with. Something I come here wanting to do for a little while is shoot not necessarily just blue hour, but almost straight up night. And that's really challenging. It's trying to find birds in Vermont. There's other places, other states you can go to where you can go to piers, you can go to cities that have water on the coast where there's enough light where you can shoot, into the night to some degree. And Vermont's really hard. We don't have not nearly as much of that, and wanted to kind of experiment with that and do almost some kind of like urban shorebird photography, which is a little bit unique here. What you're looking at is a lesser yellowlegs. I shot this out at the mouth of the Missisquoi. It's a very north end, just before you hit the Canadian border. To get this image, I went out, had it planned. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Went out there. I knew lesser yellowlegs is a species that I could, at the time, I think it was probably in August, September sometime, fairly reliably expect to be there. And you got to get in a kayak, got to go across. A lot of folks I know take that trip to do some bird photography or some birding out there. So wait till dark. This is maybe a half hour after dark, and the lesser yellowlegs have just kind of been sitting there. This is where they like to roost. They'll sit here for the night, and the big orange ball you see behind is actually the light of the house from the launch point, which is maybe a mile, maybe slightly more away, and created what we call a bokeh ball in photography. So I was able to line that up with the bird, and I thought that was kind of a cool image. Thought it was so cool that wanted to kind of do a little bit better. I thought, this image is still not great. It's a little noisy. the bird wasn't lined up quite the way I wanted to. I thought I could do better, so I actually went out and did it again and created this image. And I was really pleased with this, kind of a unique image to me. It's a perfect ball behind the head, had it lined up really nicely. Just watched this guy sit there for a while. He eventually went to sleep. I eventually got back in the kayak and went home for the night. But it was really cool to kind of have an idea in mind and actually go out and make it happen. It's things like this that I've gotten more interested in, as I've got a lot of images. Most of the species that I showed early on the list, I have some image of all of them. And trying to push more into creative ideas and do things a little bit differently and capture things that maybe some folks have seen, but just not being able to capture, or maybe not seen at all, is kind of a goal that I want to, or that I want to head to this point. And from there, trying to really make the things that are really aesthetically pleasing and just beautiful images. Takes us to the end. So, Tom?
Well, Matthew, I really don't know where to start. What struck me so much is that starting with your grandfather who inspired you, and now it is you entering into the world of birds and observing and sharing their world. But what struck me is that they have actually entered into your world, and you and they seem to have a harmonious relationship. Your images are stunning. I will not be surprised if somebody's going to ask how they can purchase some of them. We really thank you. And for those of you who are here, before we started, I asked Matthew if he would be willing to perhaps tackle other subjects. And he mentioned ducks, and then he said ducks are hard. But, you know, after seeing what he's done, I know that that would be a presentation that we would really look forward to. We thank you. We thank the Friends of Missisquoi for co-sponsoring this. If anybody has a question for Matthew on anything that you heard or saw tonight, now is the time to type it in the chat and I'll relay it to him. We also have put into our chat our link to our membership and donations. Oh, now the kudos are coming, Matthew. Spectacular. Thank you. Amazing. Wonderful. It really was. So again, you timed it out perfectly. It's an hour after we started. We thank all the participants, but most of all, we thank you. You may be low key and think that you are a birder who is doing photography, young man, but I think you are an artist. So to all, we wish you a good evening. You can see the next presentation on our Green Mountain Audubon website under events, and we wish you good birding and good photography. Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you.